Hi, everybody. This is Clement from the Wine Journal. Welcome to today's tasting. Today, I'm super excited to be tasting some phenomenal wines. I have the pleasure of having Chief Winemaker Trevor Durling from Beaulieu Vineyard out in California. Trevor, thank you so much for making this happen, and super glad to be here and tasting some great wines with you.
It is my pleasure, sir, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So we have three wines that we're going to be tasting today, but before we get started, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and your background. I know that you've been at Beaulieu Vineyard since 2017, but you've been in the wine industry since about 2003. So I'd love just to learn a little bit more about your path.
Sure. So I was born and raised in nearby Sonoma County. So grew up, in a family that had wine at the dinner table very regularly. I had an affinity to it from a very young age. My parents would teach me about it. I'd get to, taste a little bit here and there. It was just very much a part of my culture and my upbringing. I did grow up amongst vineyards and again, just loved the idea of being outside and running through the vineyards and playing. And, it was something that I quite honestly took for granted, I would say, as a youngster. And it wasn't until I went off to UC Davis right out of high school, and I was studying. I was in the undergrad program, and I decided that I wanted to take an introductory winemaking course just out of personal interest. This was my first year of undergrad there, and that was the first time that I really began considering winemaking as a professional career. And I think that at that point in time, it was well known that. I had a strong idea that, wine was something that I loved. It was a passion of mine, but I hadn't really considered it as a professional opportunity until it dawned on me that, I could combine this passion that I had. And it happened to be that I was going to one of the greatest universities in the world for winemaking, and decided that this is what I wanted to do. So I took an introductory winemaking course, absolutely loved it. And that following summer ended up doing an internship at a local Sonoma winery called Sonoma Cutrer. And this is where it really solidified my path, because I was able to apply the small amount that I had learned in this course to, real-time winemaking and actually apply it to physically doing this. I spent a lot of time in the vineyards sampling grapes and in the cellar with the team, and absolutely fell in love with it. So that following year, I went back to university and changed my entire direction towards winemaking. Finished up in 2004 and have been making wine ever since. So after my schooling at Davis, I worked a couple of vintages for a sparkling wine producer in Sonoma called Gloria Ferrer. This actually began during the time that I was going to university, and that was very much on purpose, because we had earlier harvests where I was able to complete that and then get back for fall quarter. And this just continued to further solidify that this is what I wanted to do with my career. So after finishing up at Davis, I got a job at a small high-end Cabernet producer in Sonoma Valley called Moon Mountain Vineyard. Yeah. It has been renamed Repris today. It's on the Sonoma side of Mount Veeder. And this is where I fell in love with Cabernet Sauvignon in particular. I spent just about 5 years of my career there, ultimately becoming the assistant winemaker. And I then made the leap over to the Napa Valley, joining Provenance Vineyards in early 2010. And so that's right here in the Rutherford district. And this is where I fell in love with Rutherford Cabernet in particular. So worked for the great Tom Rinaldi there, who was formerly the founding winemaker of Duckhorn. He is somebody who I consider to be one of my strongest mentors in the business. And when he retired from Provenance, I was given the reins there. So spent a few years doing that before getting the opportunity to come over here to Beaulieu and ultimately becoming only the fifth chief winemaker since Andre Telleschef to get to craft these amazing wines. So very, very fortunate to be in this position, and we're truly able to work with some of the greatest vineyards in the world, as far as I'm concerned.
That's awesome. Thank you for taking me through that. That's really interesting and really amazing to hear. And do you think there've been kind of a lot of differences when you spend some time at doing some sparkling wine a little bit, coming to to Napa and going into the cab and really falling in love with it? Was there anything like particular that really kind of said, wow, cabs, yeah, this is it?
Yeah, I mean, growing up, I did have an affinity towards Cabernet Sauvignon when we would do tastings, at the table and things like that. In terms of winemaking, I just love the elegance and the power of the varietal. I've been very fortunate to get to taste, obviously, a lot of Cabernets from around the world. And I love how the grape expresses itself quite differently, obviously, depending on where it's grown. But I think just that richness, the power, and the ageability is something that really speaks to me with this varietal. Here at Beaulieu, being the fact that, we're one of the oldest wineries in the Napa Valley, we have access to some really, really amazing back vintages, some of which I was introduced to, long before I was affiliated with Beaulieu. So an interesting part of my upbringing, so I don't have any family members who are directly in the wine business. And ironically, my father spent most of his career in the beer business.
Okay.
Which is pretty funny because, as winemakers, we like to say that it takes a lot of good beer to make a great wine, which is very true. But again, he's much more of a wine drinker than a beer consumer, honestly. And so we actually have a family friend who, hosts a monthly tasting group, has been doing this for many, many decades. And early upon my time at UC Davis, I was invited to a tasting where the theme was the 1968 vintage Napa Valley. So this would have been in around 2001 or so. And so I was able to taste, we had a Heights Martha's Vineyard from 68, Inglenook Cabernet, Inglenook Charbonneau, Georges de Latour Private Reserve, all these amazing wines from this fabled vintage. And the wine that stood out to me and absolutely blew me away and solidified the fact that I wanted to become a winemaker happened to be the 1968 Georges de Latour Private Reserve. And, so to now be fortunate enough to come full circle and get to lead that producer that, that left that impression on me all of those years ago is really an honor. I had that, impression early on. I love aged Cabernet. And I just think it's one of the greatest varietals in the world.
That's awesome. Now, was 1968 the oldest BV vintage that you've ever tasted? Or...
No, I've tasted vintages going back into the 1940s.
Wow.
So the first vintage of Private Reserve, which we'll get to in a little bit, was 1936. And this is a wine, of course, we're tasting the 2018 today, but this is a wine that really, changed the landscape of winemaking across the Napa Valley early upon its first release out into the market. And so an incredibly important wine, not only for us here at Beaulieu, but in terms of the California wine industry in general. And we do have back vintages. In fact, I have 2 bottles of 1936 that are left in library. And those are very heavily guarded.
Yeah. How do you think, if you were to open those today, how do you think they would, obviously they're going to be old, but I mean, it must be even tasting wines back in the 40s.
Oh, yeah.
50s must be, I think the oldest one I've tasted was probably in the late 60s or early 70s. It must be an experience. It must be something so special and unique. And at that point, you kind of maybe forget the taste a little bit and just focus on the experience and just the history a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm very fortunate in that many of our library wines here, first of all, have never left the building, which is phenomenal. Okay. So they've been perfectly stored. And this is, I'll get into the story a little bit later, but there was actually a secret cellar that André Telescheff had here at the winery that was constructed during the 1950s, where he would stow away a lot of these vintages, right? And that actually was not discovered by the greater public until about 2010. So this is something that was under lock and key for a very, very long time. And the tradition was that the key would be passed down from winemaker to winemaker. And for that reason, we have these perfectly preserved vintages. But not only that, many of the vintages that were older than 1970 or so were recorked in the late 70s, early 80s. And so they have aged very, very gracefully. Of course, you'd expect a little bit of bottle variation depending on the vintage. You can have bad bottles here and there, but we have done quite a few inventory tastings of back vintage wines with various journalists and whatnot over the last number of years. And most of the vintages of Private Reserve in particular, going back into the 1950s, are still showing quite well, assuming they've been aged properly.
Right. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, So the story about the secret cellar, we'll talk about that a little bit later, I guess.
I can elaborate on it a little bit more. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So that's awesome. That's really intriguing. I have some few questions there, so we'll chat about that in a bit. Tell me a little bit more about Beaulieu Vineyard and its history for again for the few people that may not know about Beaulieu.
Sure. So we are one of the oldest and longest continuously operated wineries in the Napa Valley, being founded in 1900 by Georges de Latour. Georges de Latour was a Frenchman who was born and raised in a tiny village in southwestern France, just outside of the Bordeaux district. He did have background and experience in agriculture, certainly viticulture, enology. His family had a vineyard that was actually decimated by phylloxera at one point. And so this was a devastating thing for him and his family very early on. But it turned out that this was a great experience that he had gone through, that would help him later on once he arrived in the United States. And I'll get to that in just a moment. So he was really, although he had all this experience in wine and in grape growing, he was really an entrepreneur at heart. And so he first moved to the United States in the early 1880s with the idea of building an amazing business here in the U.S. This was post-gold rush era. Out here on the West Coast, people were making these, building these amazing businesses and doing very, very well. He wanted to be a part of that action, but he had a long-term vision and dream of producing his own wines in the New World that would ultimately rival those of his native country. And so in the early 1880s, he formed a company called California Tartar Works. So he landed in San Francisco. And what he would do is he would travel up to the wine region, so mainly Sonoma, as well as Napa at that time. He would get to know some of the local vintners and basically enter their fermentation tanks and scrape off the tartrate crystals from inside of the tank. Now, tartrate crystals are, that's something that naturally forms during grape fermentation. It's the same thing as, when you open up an aged red, you see the wine diamonds that are on, the bottom of the cork, and also the sediment that forms on the side of the bottle on the inside. That is cream of tartar, actually. So potassium bitartrate, those are the tartrate crystals. And this is something that was just being discarded before. So he saw this as an opportunity where he would capture this waste, essentially, purify it, and bag it up in 100-pound bags and sell it. Cream of tartar obviously is heavily used in baking, et cetera. And so he made a relatively decent living doing this. But this was really just to gain enough money to ultimately purchase some land in California and start producing his own wines. So fast forward to 1900, he sold his business, California Tartar Works. At that point, he actually had 3 different facilities where he was purifying this and bagging it up, et cetera. And he purchased 4 acres of property on the Western Rutherford Bench and a small home, and ended up moving his family to Rutherford. And I think the reason that he had such a strong affinity towards the Napa Valley at that time, which of course was far less developed than it is today. In fact, there were more prune trees planted in the valley at that point than grapevines, which is really, really interesting detail. So what really drew him to this area is the fact that he had this feeling around the terroir, the sense of place, the microclimate. He knew and was able to accurately predict that this area would one day, grow grapes that would ultimately rival, and create wines that would ultimately rival those of his native country. But also from a logistical standpoint, the fact that the Napa Valley opens up towards the south to the San Francisco Bay was very advantageous for him in terms of trading. So moving his wines in and out, quite easy there. In fact, the railroad used to go right in front of this winery, and that became very important during the Prohibition era. So anyway, he purchased this 4 acres of property, the small home. His wife, when she first landed on the property, said, "Quel Beaulieu, what a beautiful place." Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that's what they named the vineyard. So a couple of years after that, the adjacent property came up for sale, and he purchased the adjacent 125 acres and founded our original vineyard, which we still own today. It's called Beaulieu Vineyard number 1. It's a little under 130 acres total and about 80 acres planted right there smack in the middle of the Western Rutherford Bench. And many of our greatest blocks of Cabernet are grown there. And a lot of what makes up Georges de Latour Private Reserve, which is our flagship, comes from that vineyard. So a little bit later, he purchased another vineyard in the southern end of Rutherford called BV number 2. That was in 1910, and planted more Cabernet there. Now, it's important to note that actually, when he first purchased that original property in 1900, he actually planted about 80 acres of Petite Syrah at first. So again, there were mainly prune trees on the property. There were some grapevines, but it all needed to come out. He did that. He started producing small amounts of his own wine, but he was actually selling many of his grapes in the early stages. Interestingly, this was also a point in time where it became well known that phylloxera, that nasty bug that lives in the soil that can completely ruin grapevines, also existed here in California. And so people were losing their vineyards left and right. And he saw this as an opportunity to help salvage many of these vineyards by importing grapevines from France that were grafted onto phylloxera resistant rootstock. And so he was essentially acting as a nursery. He was, helping to salvage many of his neighbors' vineyards. And if it weren't for that act, a lot of them would have gone under, unfortunately, because of phylloxera. But the third and most important thing I would say that he began doing during the early 1900s is producing sacramental wine for the Catholic Church. And this is actually through a connection that his wife had with the church based in San Francisco. And this became obviously very important once we fast forward a little bit later to the Prohibition era. So between 1920 and 1933, that is when the US entered Prohibition. So it was illegal for, anybody, it was illegal to produce alcohol and sell it of any kind other than through the use of sacramental purposes or medicinal purposes. And so he had a license to do both of these things. And this was a period where, the vast majority of producers around the area were shutting down. But he was one of the very few to not only survive this period, but to truly thrive. In fact, Beaulieu quadrupled in size between the years of 1920 and 1933. And when Prohibition was finally repealed, he was producing over 1 million gallons of wine per year. And this, again, was through sacramental wine production, and also medicinal wine to a lesser extent. But doctors were actually prescribing wine to patients as medicine. And he had a license for this as well. So very, very intelligent businessman, saw an opportunity there and flourished. After Prohibition ended, he really turned his focus to quality of winemaking and wines coming out of Beaulieu. And so he had become quite a bit older, and he wanted to pass off the winemaking reins to somebody preferably trained in enology in Europe, to come over and to really overhaul the level of quality of wines coming not only from Beaulieu, but from the region of the Napa Valley in general. And so he met a man named André Telescheff at the Pasteur Institute in Paris in 1937, and was able to convince Telescheff to come back with him to a relatively unknown place called the Napa Valley later in 1938. Where Andre became one of the most important figures in the history of American winemaking. And so, he's somebody that's really credited with overhauling the landscape of winemaking here. He really focused on, a scientific approach to winemaking. He would use, his strong knowledge in the fields of microbiology and, things that we take for granted today, like inoculating fermentations with known strains of yeast, et cetera, malolactic fermentation, all these things that weren't really a common practice in California prior to his arrival. And almost overnight, the quality of wines coming out of Beaulieu just skyrocketed. So you had a lot more successful fermentations, wines fermenting to completion. You had just these amazing wines that were coming out of the area. And he was also very collaborative. So he really tutored and mentored many of the greats that came after him, such as Robert Mondavi and Joseph Heitz and Mike Jurgich and all these guys that ended up, working through André Telescheff at a certain point. Today, we own and farm about 1,100 acres throughout the Napa Valley, roughly half of which are located here in the Rutherford district, right in the middle of the valley. But we do have vineyards spanning as far south as Carneros, so the coolest part of the Napa Valley, and all the way to the north in Calistoga, which is the warmest area. And we produce many amazing wines from these different regions. But Rutherford is at the core of what we do.
Very, very cool. And thank you for that. That's really awesome. One more question before we get into the tasting. What's your vision as being a chief winemaker at Beaulieu for this year, for the next few years? What is your the vision of the future for Beaulieu?
Well, first of all, I take my role as a great responsibility to essentially I'm the steward of one of the greatest, stories and pieces of history in the American wine industry in general. And
No
so,
pressure.
what's that?
No pressure.
No pressure, right? So I am very aware of the vision that all these great people that came before me had when founding this place. I think we're so fortunate to have, again, some of the very best vineyards, certainly in the entire region. And so my goal is to express a strong sense of place through all of the wines that we produce here, and to continue to maximize and elevate the level of quality and finesse coming from our property and resonating through our wines. And so, we do have some of the latest and greatest technology and winemaking available at our fingertips. So I have tools certainly that, somebody like Telesjeff would not have had all of those years ago. And so for me, it's just really building on the amazing foundation that was already created. But again, it's that pure expression of the terroir that we're so blessed to have. I mean, that is really my, what drives me. And again, I think we've just got some of the best land in the business. And so it's a continuous step upward.
Yeah. And so I just thought of one more question that's kind of ties into that. Knowing that you produce such phenomenal wines today, you kind of think to yourself, well, how much better can wines get? Right? Of course, technology, things are going to keep evolving. But again, wines are amazing. Beaulieu wines are amazing today. How much more do you think you can just keep making wines better and better? Do you think there's still sky's the limits? Because I mean, it's what you've done today is phenomenal. So you ask yourself, like, where's the limit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think, yes, to a certain extent, yeah, the sky is the limit. I mean, I think, practices in viticulture and winemaking are always improving year in and year out. I think there is such thing as a wine that is almost too clean and too perfect to where it can almost become a little bit one-dimensional. So you want to have some of those, a little bit of variability, certainly in terms of, vintage differences. You want the wine to express the weather pattern that Mother Nature gave you for that year. You want to have differences in vintage and that type of thing. But what is phenomenal about the technology that we have today is that we are able to more easily adapt to various curveballs and whatnot that Mother Nature throws at us. And so I think what you'll see is, in a really good vintage, that level is already very, very high. I mean, the wine is almost as great as it could possibly get. What I think you will see because of some of these improvements that I'm describing is when you have a really difficult growing season, you have, whether it's a rain event or frost or a wildfire or whatever it is, you're going to see the bar raise in terms of level of quality coming off of those difficult vintages. And that's because of our knowledge and understanding of technical viticulture and technical winemaking. And some of the, the technology that we have at our fingertips. So I think that will continue to improve. But, again, I mean, I think we're at a point now where we're already, as an industry, able to make some of the greatest wines possible off of the best properties.
Yeah, I agree. Awesome. So let's start tasting some of the wines.
Okay.
We have, 3 2018s, the Cabernet Sauvignon, the Tapestry, and then the Georges Latour Private Reserve. All 2018s. Before we start tasting them, talk to us a little bit about the vintage 2018.
Yeah. 2018 was one of the greatest vintages that I have been fortunate to make wines from in my career. Phenomenal growing season. So, really even weather pattern. We didn't have any really difficult situations that Mother Nature had thrown our way. So relatively early bud break. We had an adequate amount of rainfall during the wintertime. So the vines were pretty happy once they, started growing their new shoots. We had a pretty mild climate throughout most of the growing season. So, again, no frost events, nothing that got me really nervous during the springtime. Plenty of warm days to ripen the fruit properly, but no crazy heat spikes. So it was just a very even growing season. We saw even shoot growth, pretty good hang time. We were able to extend harvest into the latter parts of the fall which was great because that allowed for more hang time for the, the clusters to hang on the vines before harvesting them. And so we were able to gain a lot of concentration, a lot of complexity, while keeping the sugar levels at bay and maintaining that level of natural acidity. So this is also through, really good canopy management and that kind of thing. But as far as a growing season is concerned, 2018 was one of the most pleasant years that I have seen throughout my entire career. And so the bar is very high for that vintage. It's one of those vintages that I'm personally, keeping a lot of wines and I'm laying them down because I think it's going to be a very, very ageable year. So really glad that we're getting to taste these three today.
Awesome. Great. So I'm excited as well. All right. So which one do you want to start with?
Let's start with the Napa Valley Cabernet. So this is 2018 Napa Valley Cabernet. Yep.
Perfect.
Now, when you think of Beaulieu Vineyard, most people think of Cabernet Sauvignon. That is our claim to fame. Again, we're based here right in the heart of the Rutherford district, which is certainly Cabernet country in the context of the Napa Valley. Although this wine does utilize Cabernet that we have growing throughout our estate vineyards that are planted around the entire Napa Valley, with the exception of the Carneros district. So Carneros in the south, again, is the coolest part of the Napa Valley. It's close to the San Francisco Bay. A little bit too cool to grow Cabernet Sauvignon and ripen it properly. So you'll see a lot more Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, cooler climate varietals planted there. But basically, once you get about 10 miles north of that area, that's where you start seeing quite a bit of Cabernet Sauvignon. So we do have some vineyards in that region, certainly all the way through Rutherford and then all the way to the north in Calistoga. So this is really a blend of Cabernet coming from our various estate vineyards around the valley. There's a great amount of power and elegance to this wine, but it's also made in a style that's relatively approachable and easy to drink at a young age. The wine, that is.
Yeah.
This is a wine that's very plush. It's very inviting. It's got a great mid palate to it. But I am cautious around the level of tannin extraction when crafting this wine because I want it to be, very food friendly. I want it to be a wine that you can enjoy without having to lay it down for a number of years. For that reason, I'm also very cognizant of the amount and the type of oak that I'm using. Okay. So I'll table this a little bit more. So we keep it at about 35% new oak. Okay. For about 15 months. And so that allows the fruit to really express itself in the forefront and also, keeps the level of wood tannin at bay so that you have a wine that's, again, really enjoyable early on out of the gate.
No.
So it is not 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. I do blend some other complementary varietals in here. Most vintages are around 80% Cabernet. I'll blend little bits of Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot, Cabernet Franc, and the magic bullet here is a little bit of Petit Syrah.
Okay.
And that is a varietal that we still have growing at our northernmost property, BB12 in Calistoga. And it really complements the Cabernet because it adds this plushness and this roundness to the mid palate, which is another tool that I use to really soften the overall tannin profile here. So thank you. A lot of dark fruit on there, those classic Cabernet characters, blackberry, cassis, a little bit of that dried herb, which I love in Cabernet, and then just a kiss of oak that will add quite a bit to the complexity in terms of flavor and texture.
And you can definitely tell there's definitely some tannins.
Yep.
On the side. And it's not overly too powerful. And it's, for being in 2018, 3 years old, not even, it's extremely approachable and drinkable now. And I could definitely see this being stored away for a few years.
It'll definitely lay down. Most vintages of Napa Valley Cabernet, certainly the 2018, I mean, this will age for probably 15 years, no problem, if it's aged properly. But I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the tannins around the side of the palate. That's one of the beautiful things about the Rutherford district in general, is there is a lot of tannin. They're big tannins, but they're refined and they're very round. So they don't come across as being too drying.
Right.
And that allows for them to be enjoyed, from a relatively young age.
And it's very balanced, I find.
Yeah.
You can get you can get a good taste of everything, and it's controlled. It's not kind of all over the place. It's and then I feel like it has a long lasting, like you can taste it for a while, and it's still, it's just that grasp, and it's just it's really good.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, it's there is a persistent finish here, and I think a lot of that comes from, that great balance between the tannin, the alcohol, and the acidity. And so I'm somebody who really tries to, when I make harvesting decisions, regardless of the wine that I'm making for Beaulieu, I'm very cognizant of maintaining that natural acidity in the wine. And that is something that I think will really help it age gracefully, and also keep it fresh and bright, and balance really well with the other components that are in the wine. So that's an important component.
What's the percentage, the alcohol percentage on that? Probably 14s?
This vintage would be, they're usually about in the mid fours. This is 14.7.
Yeah, 14.7. And it's strong. And it's strong, but again, I think you can definitely taste alcohol content, but it's not too much. It's not overpowering. You taste the wines at 14%. It's like, oh my God, it's too much. But it's really well packaged.
Yeah, I mean, I think it holds it well, and for me, it's all about that balance. Yeah, you want the wines to come across as being very balanced in terms of the alcohol, the acidity, and the tannin. And I think these hold all of those very, very well.
Very cool. No, it's good. It's be interesting to see, in a few years how well it develops. Because, like I said, and like you said, it's definitely approachable today, and you can decant this for an hour, 2 hours, keep an eye on it.
Yep.
And, make it extremely accessible. So great job on the 18 on the cab. It's really good.
Thank you. Okay, now let's go to Tapestry.
A big fan favorite. I know a lot of people talk about this wine. So, well, 2018, and this is going to be 14.7 as well. Now, is there both of them 14.7? Any particular reason? Is it a coincidence that they're about the same, or you try to
just a coincidence?
Just a coincidence. Okay.
It's just a coincidence. So that that tends to be right around where a lot of our wines come in at. And again, a lot of that comes down to your harvesting decision, obviously what your sugar level is at the time of harvest, et cetera. But that is relatively normal for many of the wines that certainly come from Beaulieu. And actually, we're probably on the lower end of the spectrum for the Napa Valley. I mean, you see a lot of producers going much, much higher than that. I'd say that we tend to be a little bit more traditional in the way that you probably harvest a bit earlier than a lot of other producers. That sugar at bay and maintain the acidity. Now, Tapestry is a wine that we have been making since 1990. So first vintage was 1990. One of my favorite things about Tapestry is the fact that it is not labeled with a specific varietal. So this is a red blend. However, each vintage of Tapestry will have something in common in that it is a blend of the 5 main Bordeaux reds. So Cabernet Sauvignon will typically be the base and the foundation and the core of this wine. So that can range anywhere from 40% to roughly 75 in any given vintage. Merlot is usually the next largest part of the blend. However, in recent years, I've really been boosting the amount of Malbec that is used here because we've been planting quite a bit more Malbec in certain vineyard blocks across our estate properties, which is a great contributor to this blend.
How come, if you don't mind me asking, how come you've been getting a little bit more of the Malbec in there?
We've been doing quite a bit of experimentation with different red varietals on certain vineyard blocks where Cabernet might not be the best choice, actually. So that includes parts of our vineyards in the Rutherford district and certainly up north in Calistoga. I find that Malbec does very, very well up there. It's very expressive, very fruit forward, very aromatic. So it's something that adds quite a bit to the complexity of the blend, and it tends to have softer tannins overall than Cabernet. So I look at as a blending tool. I look at Malbec in a very similar way that I look at Merlot. So a little bit of a softening effect to the Cabernet Sauvignon. But I find the complexity of the Malbec that we have growing on our estate properties just to be out of this world. And so particularly from an aromatic and flavor profile standpoint. So we have been going in and planting more Malbec than we have had in the past. And therefore it is becoming a stronger component within this overall blend. So that's a big contributor. And then of course, Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot to round it out. Now, each of these 5 varietals is bringing something very different to the table, but equally important when it comes to this overall blend.
Right.
One of my favorite things here, though, is the fact that, you know, in any given year, the percentage of these different varietals can fluctuate greatly. And so really it is a story of what Mother Nature has given us for that growing season. Because of that, it's one of my favorite wines to taste vintages side by side, because, you know, you'll have that central core of consistency, but you will have variation in what the blend looks like.
Have you ever had a vintage? And if not, would you want to try it one day to maybe have Malbec overpower the Merlot a little bit? So it's mainly Cabernet Sauvignon and Malbec.
I think in recent years, we have actually had a couple of vintages where
Oh,
that has
really? Have
happened.
you? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We also actually bottle 100% Malbec for the property that's sold only out of the visitor center. But really, really interesting varietal when you're in the right location in the Napa Valley. Yeah.
Okay, because I don't think I've ever tasted 100% Malbec from California. You know,
come visit and give it a shot. It's one of the favorites.
Yeah, cool. All right, so let's see what we have here. So the first thing on the nose, so much more elegant and so much more refined, but still at the end has, you know, that power and that kick.
A lot of those characteristics that we were describing in the Napa Valley Cabernet, so that dark fruit profile, but a little bit more complexity here and a little bit more going on aromatically. I mean, you have a little more elements of red fruit. So there's some cherry, there's some cola, some really interesting blueberry notes and violet that I get, and that's coming mainly from the Malbec and the Petit Verdot. But it's also a bigger wine, so it's structured a little bit more heavily. This wine gets quite a bit more new oak, so you're looking about 60 to 70% new French oak for about 20 or 21 months, depending on the vintage. And so it is a wine that has a large structure and certainly one that you can lay down for a number of years.
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely more redder fruits, and the tannins are still present. I feel like they're a little bit more subtle, but at the same time still gives you that power, and they still evaporate through the side, but just a little bit more control, I feel like.
Yeah.
Is that kind of accurate?
I would say that's very accurate. Yeah. It's also one of our wines that probably has the highest level of acidity. And so for that reason, it comes across as it's extremely elegant. It's refined, it's focused, and it's a wine, again, that can lay down for many, many years to come.
And you said more acidity than the first one, right? Than the cab?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I can definitely taste it, especially at the top of my palate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, some of the Merlot used in this blend actually comes from the southern parts of the Napa Valley, so cooler growing climate, which will, you know, naturally give you that higher level of acidity.
Phenomenal. And this, would you say, at least 20 years?
Oh yeah, I've recently opened up a few weeks back. I opened up a 95 Tapestry, which was absolutely phenomenal, and I could have laid down for another 5 years, no problem.
And the legs. And what I've liked about this so far is that they're two great wines. Obviously, they're different types of wine at different levels, but they each, I feel like, have their own identity. You know, they're unique and they have their uniqueness. You know, it's not kind of like, okay, well, this one's the same, but it's just a little bit more elegant. They truly have their own stamp, and they're very unique in their own ways, which is really nice.
Well, thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Save one of the best ones for last.
There we go. So last but not least, let's go with the 2018 Georges de Latour Private Reserve. So this is our flagship, our icon, and our pride and joy coming out of Beaulieu Vineyard. So we're tasting the 2018 which is the 82nd vintage of this wine. So first vintage being in 1936. This wine was, again, one that completely changed the landscape and the benchmark and standard of quality in terms of Napa Valley winemaking. And so when André Teleschef first arrived in 1938, one of the things that he first did actually was to taste through the 1936 vintage, which at that point was still in tanks and barrels, had not been bottled yet. And he knew Georges de Latour's vision of wanting to come out with a flagship wine under the Beaulieu Vineyard label. And he determined that there was the quality potential there from the 36 vintage to do that. So he went through and he selected his favorite lots from that year. They bottled everything else and they held those gems over for an additional year. Ultimately blended it, put it in bottle in 1939, and actually did not have a name for it at the very beginning. So actually, before this wine was named, it was entered into a wine competition on Treasure Island in San Francisco called the Golden Gate International Wine Expo. And for the first time, you had a panel of judges who were looking at each other going, wow, I've never seen quality at this level come out of the Napa Valley region. And so very quickly after that, so it was awarded, it was regarded very, very highly. It made, a big splash right then and there. And then ultimately upon its first release, by the way, at $1.25 per bottle, at that time, which was outrageously expensive in those days, it had really become the new benchmark and standard of quality for the entire region of the California wine industry in general. So the reason that it was named Georges de Latour Private Reserve is that by the time it was released, which technically was 1941 when it was officially released, Georges de Latour had passed away. So he died in 1940, and Teleschef and his widow decided to name the flagship in his honor. And very quickly, again, after its first release, it had gained a strong name for itself early on, right out of the gate. But it became one of the official wines of the White House. So it was poured across the U.S. It was used by U.S. presidents to serve to foreign visitors at state dinners, et cetera. And it really was the benchmark and standard of quality coming out of the entire region. And so one of my favorite things about what we're able to do today is the fact that we're essentially using those same exact vineyards and we have that same terroir today, as they did all of those years ago when they were making these early vintages of Private Reserve. So for that reason, it is an incredible experience to taste through multiple back vintages of this wine, because you notice, changes in winemaking style and climate and technology and all those things, but there's this central core of consistency, which is that terroir that we're so fortunate to have. And it really comes down to Rutherford. I mean, this wine is really heavily based on our Rutherford vineyards. And there is an element of Rutherford dust to this wine, which is, something that is very distinct of Cabernet in particular grown in the Rutherford district. I like to describe it as more of a textural thing where it's a cocoa powder texture and flavor profile that hits you on the mid palate, goes into the finish. It's this this amazingly unique texture. And it's something that, I think critics and wine lovers from around the world look for when identifying Cabernet coming from the Rutherford district.
Very cool. I'm excited. One quick question. If you had one vintage to taste for the Georges Latour Reserve, what year would it be?
Oof. Well, I've been fortunate enough to taste through most vintages.
Okay.
And I still have to go with the 1968.
1968.
It is just one of the most incredible vintages and incredible wines that I've ever had in my entire life.
What?
It's truly phenomenal. And that was a Teleschef year. So he was with us from 1938 until he retired in 73.
Okay.
And then actually came back as a consultant at the age of 90 years old in 1991. And he passed away in 94.
Wow.
Right. The Dean of American Winemaking, very, very important figure for us at Beaulieu, but also in terms of the history of the American wine industry.
Right. All right, let's test this. Wow. Is it mirror? It's a lot on the eye. It's a lot darker. I feel like, right?
Oh yeah, tremendous amount of concentration in this wine. This is one that is certainly built to age for a very, very long time. For those who have the patience to do that. It is primarily Cabernet Sauvignon, although I do occasionally blend little bits of Petit Verdot, and actually this vintage has a splash of Malbec in it.
Okay.
Incredibly concentrated color, tannins, flavor profile, just, it's a very big wine, but it has quite a bit of elegance to it as well. And so again, it has that high level of natural acidity, which is going to help it age gracefully. When thinking about the oak regime here, we're at about 90 to 95% new French oak for 21 months minimum. And so you get a lot of that oak tannin that's integrating. I use mostly medium and medium plus toasted barrels, which will be, adding a little bit of structure and a little bit of that toasty character, but in no way does it overpower the fruit whatsoever. So we're very, very specific about barrel producers that we use and toast levels and all of those things to make sure that what we're using really add to the complexity, but don't overpower that expression of terroir. Now, the other really unique thing that I want to mention when it comes to this wine is that there's an element of barrel fermentation on the skins that's used when making this wine. And so that can make up between 30 and 40% of the wine itself. And that's where I will take a standard, French oak barrel, about 225 liters or 60 US gallons. We'll remove the head of the barrel, and then we actually crush about 400 pounds of Cabernet must directly into the barrel on skins and everything, put the head on the barrel, and then we roll them during the fermentation process to get that extraction from the skins. And so the reason for that is that we get early oak integration, but also the heat of the fermentation helps to pull some of those wonderful oak tannin, oak flavors, tannins, and actually sugars from the wood itself integrate into the wine, and it gives you that perception of softness and roundness that is actually adding quite a bit of intensity and ageability at the same time. So it's incredibly labor intensive, and it's something that we only do on our very, top wines.
Right.
But it is a really, really interesting blending component here, and it helps us to address, what I'd consider to be the modern winemaking challenge, which is how do you create a wine that, at this level that you can lay down and age for decades and decades, but also tastes rounded and delicious relatively early right out of the gate. I mean, we're tasting an 18 here, which is a baby.
Yeah.
This was recently released, and there's many, many years to go, but not showing in a way, in my opinion, that says, hey, you need to lay this down before enjoying it. It's enjoyable.
And I feel like it's it's I've seen it kind of across some other wineries as well, but it's amazing how you're able to today, you as a winemaker, are able to make such great wines that can be laid down for so many years drinkable today. Because I feel like 10, 20 years ago, being able to drink a really good wine that you could lay down for a long period of time, it would be a bit hard to drink a couple years after, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's just so amazing in being able to, to drink a wine today and then really lay it down. What I love to do is I love to buy a case or two of a specific wine and maybe like every year have a bottle.
Yeah.
I'm trying to see how it's evolving. And, I don't do it with too many wines, unfortunately, but I think that's just so interesting to do, just to really see like, hey, this wine was great today, a few years later, and it's going to be great in 24 years. Right?
Totally agree with you.
Or longer. So I think that's pretty cool what, you've been able to achieve.
Thank you very much.
And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, I agree with what you're saying, which, we do this quite often where we will taste, back vintages, and we'll go through the inventory and just follow them along year on year and see how they're aging and progressing.
Yeah, that's so cool. And one thing that's really stunning to me is when I drink this and when I taste this, in a way, it's so thin. The wine is so thin and elegant, but yet it's so complex. And to me, that's amazing, because I feel like it's just like if you're trying to pack a bunch of clothing to a suitcase, but the suitcase is tiny and you're taking out a full wardrobe full of clothes,
Yeah.
right? How you're able to pack that much complexity into a wine and having the taste be so smooth and so elegant and so well balanced. To me, that's just, I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
It makes perfect sense.
it's stunning. It's stunning to be able to have that complexity and that power in such a smooth wine. Um, that's what I've noticed a
Well,
lot here.
thank you. Well, that all starts in the vineyard, and really, that's what I'm talking about when I'm describing that pure expression of terroir. And so, it's a really interesting combination in that we are such a historic winery, and we've owned our vineyards for so long, and so we know every single vine throughout our entire property. And I use very traditional winemaking methods in terms of really respecting the fruit itself and trying to intervene as little as possible. But we do combine that with some of the latest and greatest technology available in winemaking. And so that means that there's a lot of input in the vineyards in the early stages of fermentation and all those things. And then once the wine goes down to barrels, we try to touch it as little as possible. And that allows for that purity and that expression that you're describing. And I think it's really a wonderful combination. And a great approach that those that came before me always had, and I'm continuing the tradition.
Yeah, very cool. Well, listen, I know that we have to get going, but I do want to ask you one more question. If you want to finish up the story about the wine cellar,
Yes,
because that's super intriguing before we wrap up.
Yeah. So again, this is something that Teleschef started sometime in the early 1950s. And this was because he saw that, many of these vintages, particularly of private reserve, were selling through and they weren't keeping a big, historic archive. And so he took it upon himself to create a cellar in the winery where he would actually put a number of cases aside, knowing that, Beaulieu would be very, very happy to have these many, many years down the road. And so this was something that he kept. It was a little secret door that went through the laboratory, up these stairs, and up in the attic area where he had a little cutout that led to a room that only he and the facilities manager knew about. Wow. And so they would bring a number of cases of each vintage of private reserve up there for safekeeping. It was temperature controlled, had a really nice racking system, and ultimately, by the time it was fully discovered, because it had outgrown the space, which was around 2010. We had all of these back vintages with only a couple that were missing, that had never left the property. And so I was fortunate enough to actually work a vintage here. I didn't really touch upon this when I was talking about my history, but in 2009, the winery that I was working for, Provenance Vineyards at the time, it was just before I officially started there, was a sister property of Beaulieu. And so I was able to spend a harvest here, getting to know this facility, the winemaking team that came before me, and all of that. And as a thank you for my services at the end of that harvest, I was taken up there by the head winemaker, who happens to be my direct predecessor. I was told, well, look, I don't want you telling anybody about this because nobody actually knows about it. This is a secret amongst BV winemakers, but you can pick any bottle that you want and take it. So I did choose a 1968, going back to that story that I had, during my time at UC Davis as a student, where I had that incredible tasting experience. So it really is an incredible story, an incredible legacy, and that is the reason why we have a number of these back vintages still in our possession today.
That's phenomenal. So real quick, so nobody knew about that secret place, just the winemaker and maybe a couple other persons.
Yeah, the winemaker and basically the superintendent.
And the superintendent.
Try to get up there for mechanical reasons. Yeah.
And so was there a gap in between anybody knowing about it when it got discovered in 2010?
No, because I had known about it at that point in time, and I think what had happened was, my predecessor had to move a lot of those vintages out of there. Because, well, first of all, the temperature control started failing, and so you don't want to have, because it's in a pretty high part of the winery, and so it would get very warm up there if that unit failed. And also, it just outgrew the space, and so they decided it was time to get this out of there. Let's put it in another location that's a little bit better temperature controlled. And there was no point, at that stage to keep this a secret anymore. This is something that was really exciting, that needed to be shared with everybody, around the winery. And so at that point in time, it became far more common to use a lot of these vintages and back vintage tastings and, critics and journalists, et cetera.
Was there, was there a lot of bottles up there?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Quite a few.
Like thousands or?
Yeah, in the thousands,
Yeah.
definitely in the thousands. And much of it now has actually gone back to the visitor center and is available for sale. But we do keep, a significant portion of it in the winemaking library for historic tastings and really important events and things of that nature.
What's the secret place now? Is it just empty? And is there anything else?
It's empty at the moment. It's in the part of the winery that we're currently we're about to renovate that specific area. So but that will always be something that is part of the overall experience. If we ever do any upgrades to the visitor center, et cetera, that that concept and theme should be a part of the overall experience, because it's a really cool story that
it is.
A lot of people don't know and we don't talk about very heavily.
Right. Yeah. And you don't hear that too often. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, I know you have to run before we start recording. Trevor, thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me. I know you're super busy. Thank you for producing some phenomenal wines. They are truly amazing. And guys, I know most of you will know Beaulieu Vineyards, but if you haven't checked them out yet, please check them out. They're worth it. They're amazing people, great winemaker. And Trevor, thank you so much for taking the time to stay here with me today and tasting these great wines. And anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, just a huge thank you to you, Clement. I really appreciate the opportunity to taste with you. Glad to do this. Actually, one more thing I do want to mention. You probably noticed this giant decanter on a stem that I'm tasting out of right here.
Yeah.
This is actually a special glass that was designed specifically for George Latour Private Reserve. So it was a collaboration between myself and George Riedel of Riedel Glass Company.
Okay. and
you can purchase these actually at the visitor center. It's really cool. I have nicknamed it a decanter on a stem.
I love it.
The fact that that's how it functions. And so it really helps to open the wine up early on, and it makes Private Reserve taste all the better. So,
all right. Well, there you go.
I wanted to mention that before I was, since I had it here on camera, but
only at the visitor center.
Incredible glass, and it was a fun experience crafting this thing.
Yeah, only at the visitor center, right? You can't get it online or anywhere else.
Correct.
Okay, so when you go, make sure you grab a couple glasses to taste the George Latour Reserve. Well, Trevor, thank you so much again, and thank you so much, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll talk to you soon.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers. Trevor, thank you so much.